For the next 2 hours, you won't be chasing noise.
Tonight, the hour keeps itself.
Continuity can feel like anesthesia. Wake gently by reading the margins.
If you must hide the change, teach the seam to smile.
Wardrobes reassure. Questions rescue.
For the next 2 hours, keep your own time.
I was ordained in Rome, but my vows were taken in a dark that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with filing. Names, dates, volumes, keys. The church teaches you to love order until order learns to love you back, and by then you cannot tell if you chose the silence or the silence chose you. I kept a ring of iron keys for 10 years. They made a sound like small bells whenever I moved, as if warning the walls that a loyal ghost was passing. The skin beneath my belt line still remembers the weight, the mean tug on my hip. I used to think of them as teeth. Sometimes I still do. Teeth are for biting. Keys are for turning. Both are for holding something shut. In the beginning, I was given a narrow corridor and a wider smile and told that trust was a candle. You do not waste it, and you account for every inch that burns away. The corridor smelled like rain that had decided to live in stone. My superior joked that the scent would keep me sober. I laughed, because that is what you do when someone who can extinguish you offers humor. Later, much later, I realized that the smell was the breath of parchment, centuries of skins learning how to be sky. Paper remembers the knife that made it. Ink remembers the blood it mimics. The memory of materials is always older than the memory of men. I learned the floors the way a sailor learns currents. Above ground was ceremony and glass, the wheeling birds and clicking cameras, the ornate hush of rooms that want to be looked at. Underneath was function and whisper, doors without names, lamps that needed to be signed out like relics. We recorded flame with the same fastidious ink we used for mortal things. 1 wick per corridor, witness initials on the stub, time of lighting, time of death, any extraordinary sputter. Even light was placed on a leash down there. Whatever burns can be asked to account for itself. Whatever cannot is not allowed to burn. The first time I descended alone, the staircase had the humility of a winding rib cage, stone ribs, tiled spine. I paused midway to feel the air change temperature, a small pleasure, that sudden cool like a hand on a fevered forehead. The previous keeper, an old man with the soft knees of a professional kneeler, had told me to listen for the shift. Up there, you hear time by the hour. Down here, you hear time by the dust. He was right. On the upper floors, bells shape hours into obedience. Below, the dust makes a sound of its own microscopic snow, endless and unsummoned, settling with such patience that you begin to believe patience is a sound, not a virtue. I carried a ledger that first night. The pages ruled with a geometry that suggested obedience could be drawn, not chosen. It asked me to mark everything. The number of steps between this bolt and that bracket, the width of a gap in the molding, the hairline crack in a lintel that had widened by the width of a fingernail. We surveilled the building, as if it were a person prone to escapes. I signed my name on the line provided, and even then I thought, names are the first things we erase. Not publicly, of course. Not with trumpets. Erasure is a polite work. It is done with neat hands and a broom. It is done by men like me. There is a room, if room is what you call a boundary, that keeps changing its mind where the shelves wear chains. The chains are decorative in the worst way that word can be used. They mean it. The bindings have clasps shaped like spears, suns, thorned crowns. Each spine regards you with a modest arrogance, like a veteran who has earned the right to sit without standing when a superior enters. We call them the charters, the indices, the registers of registers. Long titles in long languages wait on their covers like patient serpents. Index Tridentinus, Gratis Mysterii, Liber Suppressorum. The first time I ran my finger along the lower shelf, dust gathered under my nail like a little noon. I wiped it away and pretended I had done nothing. Most jobs are this: small betrayals performed for larger loyalties. In those early months, I made the mistake of believing that the worst sin the archives could teach me was indifference, that I would come to care for nothing but the tallying of wicks and the angle of hinges. The building had other curricula in mind. It taught me to hear binding creak as speech, to feel the pulse of a locked drawer before touching it, to measure silence the way you measure a man's trust by where it begins to strain. The door that truly began it, my particular undoing, wearing the face of a beginning, was stamped a strum C in the brass of a forgotten century. The plate had been polished unevenly, so that the letters emerged from the metal with a sleepy defiance. ASTRM stars. The letter after the dash was a classification code, not an alphabet. That is what I told myself. Like a child telling himself, the shadow is only a coat upon a chair. The key for that door had a seam running through its bow, as if two siblings had been welded into one reluctant body. It turned with a sound I have not heard elsewhere, a rounded click as if the lock had rehearsed for an audience. Inside, the air was thinner, stranger. Certain rooms resist lungs, as if respiration were a currency you had not yet earned. I stood a while and let my chest teach itself a new pace. Candles live shorter lives in those places. The flames take to trembling without visible cause. A low table waited like a patient animal, its surface covered with protective linen. Beneath the linen, drawers. Beneath the drawers, categories with titles that found my bones. Astral indices, calculi temporis, charta celestis. Even now, my mouth dries on those names. Some Latin is not for prayer. Some Latin is inventory for knives. When I say map, you understand the concept and not the thing. Maps of the heavens are not like maps of the world. They show what refuses to stay still and pretend to still it. A sky is both a record and a quarrel. Men have died for less loyal representations of lesser kingdoms. The chart I unwrapped that night had the pallor of an old animal under a winter sky goat parchment, stretched to the tautness of withheld confession. At the left margin, you could see where the blades had worried it smooth. At the right, a series of pinpricks where some previous handler had fastened it to a board too hastily and been forgiven by no one. Across the field, an organized glitter of notations, little iron seeds of ink, names written in a hand that preferred accuracy to elegance. And then the wound. Torn is the word I use because it is the word for a mouth that cannot decide whether to speak or swallow. The parchment had been cut, not a tear, not a savage rip. but a deliberate incision, as careful as any surgeon working on an enemy who must live to sign a treaty. The cut ran nearly diagonal across the ecliptic, crossing the familiar houses as if refusing to pay their tolls. You could follow it from the anxious horns of Aries, through Gemini's gossip, past the lion where kings like to roar, toward Virgo's quiet, along the wound, in a scholar's ink that spoke with that reluctant authority of long custody, were dates that our calendar could not cradle. They reached for places in time where no feast or fast claimed jurisdiction. We call such days by many names, intercalations, adjustments. But there the word used was vacuum, a little emptiness, tacked like a bandage to the edge of the sky. The note pinned to the lower corner, in the same modest hand, read simply, Anno Vacuum, an empty year. I looked at it and thought, a year can be empty the way a confession can be quiet. Not nothing, just the wrong audience. I had been trained to lay such thoughts upon the altar of obedience, and watch them evaporate like water upon hot stone. That night, they refused evaporation. Steam rose and became weather. I will admit the vanity. I believed the chart had waited for me, as if the building had performed a decade-long patient experiment in finding the particular set of bruises and beliefs that might coax its throat open. This is how arrogance disguises itself as destiny. More honestly, I was the person in the room. The wound had been waiting for anybody with enough nerve and enough foolishness. It takes both. Neither the brave nor the cowardly alone qualify for the work of wrong doors opening. When I placed my palm near the cut, near, not on, I was not that foolish. The air above the parchment cooled further, the way the air above a pond cools as night rehearses her entrance. I drew my hand back and navigated the drawers for a glove. Protocol matters even to men in the process of breaking it. The glove was clean, thin, sterile in its ambition to be invisible. When my gloved fingers touched the chart's left margin, I smelled rain and stone again. I know how that sounds. I am telling you how it was. Perhaps I should say now what I have not said. I did not begin my priesthood for power or for habit. I began it because something in me preferred rooms that wanted no applause. I liked rooms that ask for listening. It is an odd calling to desire the consent of walls. But some of us are born with the itch to keep watch. Some of us believe that if the ledger is honest, the world will be obliged to imitate it. This belief lasted longer than it should have. It died that night in that room with that map and that polite wound. I leaned close enough to read the marginalia without shadowing the letters with my own head. A choir book lay partially tucked beneath the lower edge of the parchment, not as an afterthought, but as a cousin hiding behind a pillar. The notation on its pages was in a mode choirmasters would call impossible intervals that do not behave themselves, a line that looks like a snake learning to foresee its own tail. The text was brief, a Latin with an odd thirst for imperatives. Vacare, vacare, vacare. To be empty, be emptied. Emptiness commanded, not described. As I hummed a contour of the line quietly, no scandal and absurd thought became a working tool. The pitches fell, almost perfectly, upon the star points marked along the tier. The hymn mapped the wound, the voice could walk it. There was a time in my training when I would have taken this as a sign to fast and pray. That time did not survive contact with drawers that labeled saints as administrative burdens. In the room across the corridor, another ledger, the one with a binding as thick as a winter coat, held entries under Sancti Exilientes, the exiled saints. Each page carried a life and then a scissors. Ink lines canceled names. Feast days shrink-wrapped into other feasts. Lives filed under other nouns. Duplicate legends, they said. Inconvenient overlaps with rural goddesses. Healers who healed too well and too widely. We do not like our miracles efficient. Efficiency is the enemy of theater. Theater is the nurse of belief. Down there I found an index of popes that the walls would not speak loud. Pontes Obumbrati shadowed bridges. Names that didn't settle. Rings that were forged and reforged within one winter. Faces that shook hands with treaties and were immediately requested to become hypothetical. An authority that lived long enough to sign and then consented to be rumor. Even the ring, the brass note explained, can be reheated and persuaded to afford a new impression. We speak of the permanence of seals as if metallurgy admired our myths. Metal obeys heat. Paper obeys knives. People obey stories. Let me return to the room with the wound. It is not the only room, but it is the room that took up residence in me. By the candle's underestimate of its own courage, the tear looked like a shadow made rigorous. I traced it with my gaze and found, not for the last time, the suspicion that a season had been misfiled. Not erased erasure is too simple, too proud, but moved, like a painting relocated into a hallway where no one lingers. This is how control behaves when it graduates. It stops breaking, it rearranges. In a pocket at the back of the drawer, a small slip of paper had slipped into shyness. It carried 7 dates in a hand that refused adornment, days that do not exist in our transition from the old calendar to the new. We all learn the Gregorian correction like a tidy story. The calendar put on its winter coat and learned to keep pace with the sun, and the church, that old watchmaker, consented to losing a handful of days for the sake of no longer losing time. But here, on this slip, were rehearsals, not the story we tell, trials, pencil versions of the sky, experiments in how much a population can swallow before it asks the baker why the loaf has slipped out of season. When the candle stuttered, I pinched its wick and signed the ledger for a second flame. Even the act of request felt like sacrilege. More light always does in rooms that have learned how to live without it. The second wick steadied the shadow of my hand across the chart. I unpinned the choir book and set it beside the parchment. The notes wanted to be sung, but I had the sense that the room disapproved of lungs. So I sang inside my teeth, a monk's hum stolen from a child's hiding place, and watched my own shadow's mouth paint along the tier. A line of pitch, a line of cut, a line of dates that do not belong. Vacare, vacare, vacare. Empty yourself. Be emptied. There are commands that become descriptions if you perform them long enough. You will ask whether I believed. Then believed in the great accusation that people who want to sleep at night insist is only a story told by men who cannot. I did not need to believe, not that first night. I needed only to notice. Belief is a cathedral you build from many small bricks of noticing. That night gave me a brick. The next gave me another. After enough nights, a building stands and asks you to take off your hat. I replaced the cloth and shut the drawer and locked the room and walked the corridor like a man who must learn to use new legs. The ledger took my signature again with the calm of a creature that enjoys eating the same meal twice. Upstairs, the bells spoke their simple language of hour and hour and hour. Below, dust practiced its perpetual descent. I climbed back into the world of glass and choreography, crossed a courtyard where the rain had finished arguing with the stone and agreed to become shine, and watched tourists aim their cameras where the architecture asked to be flattered. I felt like a diver pretending at dry clothes. In subsequent days, the number does not matter. Down there, time puts on. Disguises my work taught me a new grammar of custody. I learned which drawers liked to stick like a conscience's, and which opened like mouths eager to justify themselves. I learned the humor of custodians, how they called the most dangerous records by pet names, because affection is a shield against panic. I heard the phrase Archivum Obscurum, first as a joke, then as a superstition, then as the only accurate description a man is allowed to speak without writing himself a reprimand. Dark Archive. The name fits like a borrowed coat, not tailored, but undeniably warm. The old kneeler retired to a villa where I imagine the air behaves, and I inherited his night watch. The registrar thin man, cuffs always exactly where his wrists ended, asked if I preferred a transfer to the bright floors. There are more windows up there, he said, as if windows were a moral class, and the air has opinions. I told him I liked the quiet. He said, "The quiet likes you," and I knew he was a man who had tried, once, to frighten a cat. You can only frighten quiet if you misunderstand it. Quiet does not recoil, it absorbs. You will forgive me for circling the same wound with different sentences. This is how confession works, when the thing being confessed refuses to be a single thing. I do not have one event to hold up with triumphant cynicism, no smoking reliquary, no index card that says in one ruthless line what men with collars dared to do. What I have is a map that uses music to triangulate a cut in the sky, and a series of adjacent drawers teaching me that memory can be placed under arrest without anyone breaking the door. I have a calendar that practiced pretending, a list of saints rediscovered as administrative redundancies, a ledger of popes who agreed to be rumors long enough to perform a task, a hymn that does not praise but locates, and a sentence that keeps using me. Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. There were nights when the corridors made weather, low drafts that walked like old women tidying altars, a rumble that was not thunder exactly, but the institutional version of it, the building clearing its throat. I took to carrying a small scrap of chalk. Chalk is a poor man's theologian. It draws unsteady lines and calls them meaning. I would mark the floor beside doors, tiny X's of rebellion that could be swept away in an hour, watching a mark vanish and then redrawing it. The next night taught me more about prayer than my first catechism. Prayer is stubborn chalk on a floor that expects brooms. Prayer does not win. It returns. Do you want the moment I realized I would have to speak this speaking? Here, into your ear, into your night. I can tell you that it arrived not with trumpets or visions, but with a human sound. In the room with the confessor ledgers, a low alcove that prefers you stoop to enter, there was a note pinned to a page by a hand that could not help but shake. The hand belonged to a priest who had been told to forget and then punished for remembering what forgetting had demanded of him. The note, "It is not sin to remember. It is sin to make remembering illegal." I lifted the pin and put the note in my pocket, and later, upstairs, I read it in the glass-bright world and watched my reflection firm around the words like a shoreline. Whatever I may be now, whistleblower, traitor, man who talks to paper, I began as a keeper. Keepers learn to recognize when the kept is a crime. After that, I stopped telling myself that I had found a mystery designed for me, and began telling myself the simpler thing. The mystery had found a mouth. In rooms like those, truths do not approach head-on. They arrive laterally, disguised as inventory. A drawer labeled Calculi Temporis contains not only star tables and festival grids, but also a pamphlet calculating how long an edited season must be sustained before a population forgets it was introduced. The number was smaller than I wanted. A people can be taught to accept a winter that never happened if given enough liturgy to stand in its place. We kneel where we are told the kneeling will be counted. Not every page is monstrous. Many are only human in the exhausted sense. Notes about budgets for oil and beeswax, instructions for restoring a spine gnawed by mice, a polite nor'easter of correspondences about how best to arrange the drawers so that a man with a torn shoulder can still perform his duties. These mercies made it worse. The monstrous prefers to be accompanied by the ordinary, so that any witness can be dismissed as a poet. He saw what he wanted to see. He imposed a pattern. But patterns emerged on their own. I merely slipped and fell into them. I remember the night I brought the choir book and the chart to the same table and allowed them to touch like old friends reunited at a train station. I hummed the line again, watching the ink dots, those obedient little universes, accept the pitch as if remembering an appointment. If you have never experienced the sensation of recognizing that the thing you are looking at is looking back, I cannot recommend it. It changes the architecture of the skull. The map's cut was no longer a wound but a path, and the hymn was not worship but an itinerary. Where did it lead? To an absence, but a shaped absence. The kind with edges and instructions and catalog numbers. I do not know if I believed then. I am not sure belief matters to a room. Rooms prefer conduct. I conducted myself as if the evidence mattered, which in that place is the only heresy available to a man who still wishes to wear his collar without gagging. I checked the registry for cross-references. I found a minor ledger with a major temper. Index Dilutionis, the thinning index. A list of names reduced until they could pass through the mesh of official memory without catching. I found a schedule of lessons designed to explain away the impulse to ask. They did not call it that, of course. They called it pedagogy. They called it formation. They used words like charity and order, and wrapped the questions in them like knives wrapped in bread. You will not notice a blade if you are hungry enough. On the surface, mornings continued to proceed with their pretty obedience. I carried my collar like a quiet apology. I forgot my own umbrella and accepted the rain as penance. People prayed in front of things that were not what they pretended to be, and I did not shout. That is not courage. That is the profession. The old kneeler sent a postcard of a lake that was too blue to live. The registrar asked me again if I wanted the bright floors. "It is good for the lungs," he said. I told him the dark was good for mine. "Then breathe carefully," he said. Air down there is not simply air. It has opinions. He was a man who pronounced warnings as compliments. This is a gift. Most warnings dress as scoldings and are therefore refused. You may be impatient for a catastrophe. We are trained by cheap stories to expect whistles and collapsing ceilings. Catastrophe, when it is professional, wears good shoes and keeps appointments. Mine arrived as a request to reconcile two inventories, the candles against the candles, the maps against the maps. Ordinary work, if you have not been paying attention. Extraordinary if you have. When I came to the drawer with the astrum plate and found the chart absent, all the air in the room pressed my chest with the courtesy reserved for the soon-to-be fired. There on the table, where I had not left it, and where no one would leave anything, sat the choir book alone. The chart had been signed out. The ledger recorded a time, a code, a signature. The signature was my own. I do not sleep easily. I do not forget easily. I had not signed it out, which means either the ledger had learned forgery, a joke I permitted myself in order to avoid a different kind of panic, or someone had decided to teach me what it felt like to be erased by neat hands. I do not believe in magic that breaks rules. I believe in men who write them. The next night, the chart returned to its drawer, as if offended by the accusation of absence. A slip appeared beneath it that I had not placed. Custodia Memorare non notitiae. The room was an institution of remembering, not of knowledge. Memory, not information, was what the locks protected. I understood then why the ledger could carry my name where I had not placed it. We were keeping memory, and memory is a negotiable instrument. It can be endorsed. You see how I am already giving you too much. That is what the truth does. It multiplies past the edges of the container you intended to pour it into, like wine in a parable, except no miracle is involved, only the yield of details when you stop making them recite catechisms. I will say this to end this first hour of my speaking. I stood at the threshold of a door that did not want to be a door, and realized I had been believing, without saying so, that silence is a sacrament. It is not. Silence is a tool. In the wrong hands, it is a tether. In obedient hands like mine, it is a leash we learn to love, because love is easier than admitting fear. I have told you about the smell of rain in stone, the weight of keys that make a body bend, the way a candle's life must be accounted for, if it is to count upon us, the polite arrogance of spines that remember the animals they once were, the grammar of drawers that stick and drawers that sigh open like confessions rehearsed for a benevolent judge. I have told you about a chart with a neat wound and a hymn that fits it like a shadow, about saints thinned into administrative powder and popes that made themselves into signatures that did not require faces. I have told you about a slip of paper that wrote emptiness down like a duty, and about a registrar who understands the air as a stakeholder. All this, and I have only begun to say what the dark taught me. What happens when you assign custody to memory instead of to knowledge? What happens when you discover that the room has more faith in its ledgers than it does in any man who signs them? I am not asking you to believe me yet. I am asking you to listen the way I learned to listen, for the change in pressure when you cross a threshold, for the unfamiliar tremble in a flame that considers rebellion, for the sigh a building gives when a room decides you have earned one more inch of its silence. In the next hours I will show you what the tear in the sky cut from us, and where the hymn tries to lead a voice that both belongs and does not. For now, accept this much. I was not born brave. I was born attentive. Attentiveness looks like courage when the room begins to speak. If your lights are low, keep them low. If the window is open, let the night have its way. My name does not matter. Names are the first things we erase. I kept keys for 10 years. They bit the hand that fed them. And one night, in a room that prefers lungs to hum instead of breathe, I placed my gloved fingers on the margin of a map and felt the stone around me draw a careful breath. Some doors open only once. Some, when they open, never close again. This is how mine began to swing. I did not sleep between that first contact and the second descent. I practiced the ritual of pretending to, which is a monastic discipline in its own right. You lie still. You borrow the breath of a sleeper and wear it like a borrowed coat. You rehearse how you will move through the building when the building begins moving through you. Dawn arrived with its gentle tyranny bells, chores, the liturgy, a river that will carry even the inattentive if they lie flat. I let the river carry me. I answered the responses with a voice that sounded like mine. I tasted the bread as if hunger meant only stomach and not the other organs. After prime, the corridors were thinner, as if morning takes a small tithe from architecture. Paper carts murmured. Brooms wrote their temporary sentences. I signed the lamp ledger 1 wick, 2, because habit would not forgive the memory of last night's tremble, and descended. Men upstairs nodded at corridors as if they were colleagues. I nodded at the stairwell as if it were a confessor. Steps count you, whether or not you count them. That is their liturgy. The brass plate, a strum C, had not learned humility overnight. It continued to glimmer with the bad manners of objects that know they hold leverage. The key warmed quickly in my palm, then cooled exactly when the lock conceded. That tiny weather is the courtesy of well-made metal. Inside, the same thin air, the candle's same skepticism, the same table with its linen that believed itself to be a veil and not a cloth. I felt, as one feels when one stands before a friend who has decided to be generous again, a mixture of relief and suspicion. Relief because the drawer would open. Suspicion because drawers that open are almost as dangerous as drawers that do not. The chart lay where I had left it, only in the unfaithful sense. Its position was obedient, its meaning already gone feral. Last night, I had been an intruder in someone else's room. Today, the room had invited me to stand, and invitations in such places are simply commands that have learned to purr. I unrolled the parchment again, registering the faint recoil of the glove's powder on the goatskin, the dull shine of the wound, as if it had been burnished by worry. I reached for the choir book. Its vellum had the modesty of a clerk who knows he knows more than his supervisor, and set it beside the chart, like two witnesses instructed not to speak to one another. I was prepared to hum. What I was not prepared for was the drawer beneath the table's lip that decided to unstick under my hand. Inside, wrapped in a strip of linen that had learned its duty so well it would have made a good monk, lay an instrument, not a compass, not exactly, though it had the intent of one. A little brass spider of a device, arms hinged with the forgiveness of centuries, ends sharpened into points, not to pierce but to insist. Along its spine, a scale nobody had taught me letters that were not Greek, not Latin, and numbers that behaved only long enough to suggest they could. I lifted it as one lifts a sleeping child from a pew. The registrar calls such instruments custodial accidents, things that have placed themselves where they may be useful, and will pretend obedience if you pretend you have a right to use them. On the map, the spider's legs found stations, as if the parchment had been waiting for pain that would not draw blood. The left leg landed on the beginning of the cut near Aries. The right leg tested Virgo's hem. The middle bent itself with officious care over Leo's absence, like a clerk willing to certify that a man was not there. The scale along the spine, aligned with small ticks I had not noticed the night before, hairline notations, tracked along the wound like stitches along a surgeon's proudest scar. Whoever made this instrument made it for this chart, or made the chart for the instrument. That is the terrible luxury of institutions. They can make tools to fit lies until the lies fit hands. I placed the spider's head at the slip labeled Anno Vacuum and felt the table's surface vibrate. It was so faint that I blamed my own blood for pretending the wood had learned how to have a pulse. But the candle moved with a solidarity candles don't typically show. I steadied it with 2 fingers and peered at the scale. Beside the impossible letters ran the ordinals of feast days, names I knew, holy men and women whose stories had been printed on prayer cards and pressed into my palms as a boy. Here, their order shuffled with the casual cruelty of a dealer who knows the house always wins. A winter's worth of observances had been lifted and set down a little to the left, not enough to revolt a calendar, enough to make prediction kneel to adjustment. On the back of the instrument, etched with a hand that detested flourish, Si commemoras, vinces. If you remember, you win. Rooms answer such sentences with temperature. The air cooled by a degree I felt in my gums. I told myself not to be theatrical. Then I remembered I worked for an institution that had put theater under a crown and called it catechesis. I hummed. The notes threaded the incision. The spider purred, which is to say, the metal gave off a sympathetic shiver that registers only in the part of a man that knows when he is lying. I did what men do when scale terrifies them. I reached for something small enough to hold. A paper slip at the drawer's back, written in the tidy hand I was beginning to respect as a kind of betrayal, catalogued cross-references. Pontes obumbrati, sancti exilientes, calculi temporis. But there were other names last night had not offered me. Curatorium mirabilium, the caretaking of wonders. Archivum sigillorum, the archive of seals. And, wicked little jewel, index rerum rescriptarum, the index of rewritten things. The rewritten things did not announce themselves as monsters. They arrived in neat columns, redactions justified like paragraphs, marginalia arguing that order had been improved, not altered. A parable moved because rural audiences remembered harvests more readily than vineyards. A genealogy compressed because lay minds stumble on begats. I read the justifications the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat he knows belongs to a man who wants to run a race he should not. My mouth formed the rebuttals before my better self could ask for a lawyer. We speak of Scripture as if it were stone. Stone can be chiseled. We speak of tradition as if it were a tree. Trees can be grafted. You can keep a forest and eradicate its oldest tree, and pilgrims will still take pictures and say they were there. I set the rewritten index aside and opened the seals drawer. Rings sat on velvet as if learning how to nap. Each ring had the quiet pride of a stamp that had survived wax and war and inebriated envoys. Beside each ring, a card white, unimaginative, listed the years of use, the hands allowed to wear, the documents it had kissed with authority. 2 rings bore the same crest, with a difference a child would not see and an archivist cannot ignore: a tilting of the crossbar, a change in the hatching of the shield, the lion's paw slightly overstepping its border. The card listed winter dates. The ledger cross-referenced a treaty. The treaty did not survive, which is the cleverness of treaties in such places. They do not survive in the rooms where survival would make them audible. 1 ring had been reheated. The wax had learned to forget a face. Here is where the documentary in me and the thriller in me begin to quarrel. The documentary wants to list, to show, to say, and then to verify. The thriller wants to put footsteps in the corridor behind me, and a breath at my ear, and ask whether that breath knows my name. I give them both a little of what they want. Footsteps came. The registrar has a way of distributing his weight that makes him sound like a kindly accusation. I closed the drawer with the calm of a man closing his eyes, and turned. He did not cross the threshold. That is his sacral instinct. He knows rooms have jurisdictions that punish even the well-meaning trespasser. "You signed for 2 candles," he said, without looking at the candles. He looked instead at my hands, as if my fingers might confess before my mouth. A prudent extravagance. "There was a tremor last night," I said. The flame argued with nothing. "Nothing is an excellent debater," he said. "It is undefeated." He rested his palm upon the door jamb, the way a man touches a horse to remind it he has hands. "You are comfortable here." "Comfort is not the word," he nodded. "Comfort never is," he added, as if reporting weather in a city he admired but would never visit. The room across the corridor was inventoried by a Jesuit who believed order could save souls. When he died, his successor, a Rosicrucian, believed the same, and neither would admit they were colleagues. He smiled with a sadness that had learned not to show off. "Cooperation is our least favorite miracle." When he left, I returned to the spider. I aligned its legs along the cut, with the devotion of a man aligning arguments. The scale's impossible alphabet curved letters, angles like little knives met the hairline ticks again. I noticed, then, that the ink at the cut's edge had been laid differently. The main chart was made with a pen that favored uniform strokes. The marginal ticks had been made with a tool sharpened to vanity. Whoever added them had wanted to be more precise than the man who made the stars behave on skin. Precision like that is either love or fear. In institutions such as ours, it is both married against their will and getting along with the patience of old enemies. I checked the Calculi Temporis volumes. Their bindings had been corrected twice. The spine recorded these surgeries like a ship record's barnacles. Inside, tables rolled across pages like armies, columns listing the old-style feasts, the new, the transitional, and a fourth that was labeled only with a small dagger and an italic hand. Interim, interim feasts, interim days, interim explanations. Marginal notes explained how to speak of them without admitting them. Words like provisionally and pastorally did the work of chloroform, gentle, effective, deniable. The principle was simple and cruel. If you sustain an interim long enough, it becomes an era. If you ask it for its passport, it will present one freshly issued and complain that you are making it late for vespers. At noon, I forced myself upstairs to put my eyes on sky that had not been drawn by men I did not trust. The dome's geometry tried its old consolation. Tourists tilted their heads like sunflowers. A child cried the honest cry of someone who had been promised delight and had instead received immensity. I almost envied him. Men like me are predisposed to be impressed. It is a minor vice that institutions foster as a major virtue. I returned to the stairwell with the coward's usual determination and signed again for light. In the hour that followed, a monk learns to count by hours whether or not he allows bells to assist. I made myself into the kind of witness I used to mock. I recorded angles. I copied the letters of the scale. I traced the tear on parchment with the back of the quill so as not to harm it, making a phantom of an already phantom wound. I lifted the choir book and placed it in 3 different positions relative to the chart, as if the angle could invent a new meaning, as if meaning were a fact of geometry. I hummed, this time soft enough to respect both the room and my own dignity, and felt the resonance return not sound, but intention. The pitches still found the points. The word Vacare found me. Empty. Be emptied. The command crawled into my mouth with the unsettling intimacy of a sacrament you take for another's sake. When the candle guttered, it did not do so like a failure. It guttered like a warning. The smoke wrote a line above the chart that looked like a scribe's impatient flourish, then dissolved into the same patient air. I pinched it, counted the seconds. The wick continued to glow. We are made to count in such places, and replaced it with the second flame I had earned by exaggerating prudence. The new light made the ink shine. Ink will shine if it believes it is being looked at by someone who aims to use it. I used it. I copied the note written in the professor's hand. Archivum Obscurum, Custodia Memorare non notitiae. I traced the letters slowly until their grammar changed me. Custody of memory, not of knowledge. I realized, with the gentle panic reserved for accurate conclusions, that I had misunderstood my vows. I had not promised to keep knowledge safe. I had promised to keep memory in a harness. The harness chafed. You cannot feel a leash until you lean against it. That afternoon, because obedience still had one room left to rent in me, I visited the Curatorium Mirabilium. The caretaking of wonders sounds benign. It was not. Shelves housed curiosities that had been drafted into service under the banner of holiness. An engineer's glass sphere, whose valves suggested twin lungs, now labeled Reliquary of the Breath. A mathematician's rotating armillary repainted and declared a teaching aid when its predictive accuracy made a cardinal uncomfortable. A physician's vacuum pump, ingenious and patient, housed in a gilt shrine so that mothers would believe empty space listened when they prayed for milk. I felt no anger. Anger is a showy virtue. I felt a competent weariness. The building did not need my outrage. It needed my ledger. I signed the book and looked up to find a mirror. It had been veiled, as if the room preferred not to risk reflective sympathy. Beneath the lace, I saw what I had become. A man whose collar fits, whose eyes refuse permission to glitter, whose hands know how much pressure a spine can accept before the glue confesses its age. I lifted the veil and met myself with the courtesy one offers a stranger in a pew. Behind my shoulder, in the mirror's upper corner, the door to a strum C was visible across the corridor, small as an icon, stubborn as a commandment. I returned. After Compline, the night prayer thrums the body into a compassion that can survive the lower air, and assembled my props. The chart, the choir book, the spider, the interim tables. If a crime can be committed with instruments, I was armed. I set the spider's legs, sang the interval that the choirmaster would have told me is a sin against good sense, and followed the tier along the ecliptic once more. Between Leo and Virgo, where the wound widened, the instrument's spine clicked. A tooth along an unseen rack had found its mark. Beneath the table, a hidden latch yielded like a stubborn friend. A compartment opened a drawer within the drawer, the archive's favorite joke. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, with the officious modesty of a censor, lay a packet of letters bound by tape that had outlived the law that required it. The top letter was not Latin. It was Italian of an austere sort, the kind that reads like a judge clearing his throat. It described, in the grammar of a man who has practiced sounding inevitable, a trial correction to the festival cycle, run in shadow to measure compliance. It recorded no revolt, only confusion, followed by acceptance. Establish the explanation early, it read, and add God's smile. People trust a sky that appears grateful. I wanted to put the letter back into a fire that did not exist. I wanted to return the words to the mouths that had exhaled them and make them choke. These are theatrical wishes. The documentary in me wrote the date. The thriller in me listened for steps. The bell in me did neither, and simply noticed the rhythm of my own blood. Beneath the letters, a thin volume, smaller than a psalter, titled Manuale Vacui, the Manual of Emptiness. It was not poetry. It was a guide for caretakers, written with the spare elegance of a butcher's invoice. How to speak about removed days. How to fold a missing season into homily so that parishioners believe absence is a form of mercy. How to reassign names without teaching a population to hear knives. One line, underlined by a later hand that perhaps could not help its honesty. Absence is easier to love when you teach it to perform gratitude. I put the book down with a care I did not pretend was reverence. The candle had eaten nearly half its life. I turned the spider again, set its head upon the wound at Aries, and watched, because correct watching is a kind of prayer, as the scale's impossible alphabet lined up with a second set of hairline marks I had missed. There are always second marks. This is what institutions count on. The first marks will occupy the curious, and the second will never learn the pressure of a questioning finger. The second marks called not to feasts, but to names. The choir book's text shifted beneath my eyes, not a miracle, a recognition. Where it had said Vacare 3 times, my mouth knew it now as Vocare to call. The hymn was not only a coordinate system, it was also a roll call. I hummed the interval and imagined names answering from rooms where names are kept under glass. The registrar's step returned, then did not cross the threshold. Mercy or strategy, I do not know. I realized then that I had lost the luxury of believing in luck. Luck is an amateur's providence. I signed the ledger and replaced the instruments with the defiance of a man tidying a crime scene that will not be investigated. I did not leave a note for the next me. Notes are for men who believe they will have successors. I was beginning to understand what kind of room kills its future. In my cell, the night pulled its black up over the window like a mother who still trusts blankets. I lay on my bed and watched the ceiling stain itself with the slow geometry of lamplight flicker. I said none of the prayers assigned to men who intend to wake. I did not beg. I rehearsed memory like a soldier field stripping a weapon in the dark, parts laid out where the hand can find them without insult from the eye. The torn sky, the spider, the manual of emptiness, the rings reheated, the interim days trained to pass for citizens, the hymn that both emptied and called. I let them arrange themselves in the theater of the mind, that vault without catalogue. I let them speak the only sentence they ask, remember me. Then a second, remember that you are remembering. There are men who can sleep after making such promises to themselves. I am not one. When morning returned with its honest bullying, I rose and dressed and passed men who would have recognized me as their brother if we had been trained to admit we are brothers. I stood before a basin and watched water accept a face that had not decided whether to be frightened, Fear is a useless fuel. It burns hot, fast, and leaves a smell that ruins the next meal. I chose instead the fuel I had been given in that room: attentiveness, the coward's courage. I wiped my face with a towel that smelled faintly of sun and refused to be grateful. Downstairs again, I tested the hypothesis that the building enjoyed me. The door to the Archivum Sigillorum, the seals opened with less resistance than the night before. I did not flatter myself. I attributed it to wax dust and the humility of hinges. Inside, I lifted the twin rings with the babying of a thief and, for the first time, pressed each into a wafer of warm beeswax. The impressions were siblings arguing over a birthright. Both claimed to be elder. I thought of treaties that required a winter's worth of signatures and men who could not be seen to sign them. A ring is an excellent disguise. It is a face you can put on your hand. Back to a strum sea. Back to the spider. Back to the cut that had accepted a hymn. The manual of emptiness waited where I had left it, as if daring me to betray its competence. I did. I read aloud a paragraph that had no right to exist. Instruction for teaching school children that the sky had always been thus, and that their grandparents' calendar had been a sweet error God had tolerated for a time. Smile, the manual actually said, when you explain it. The sky prefers smiles. I closed the book because my hands were beginning to forget which way to keep from shaking. Listen now. I am telling you this as cleanly as I can. I am not asking you to believe anything about conspiracies larger than what paper can carry. I am telling you what was on the pages in my hands, what the instruments did when treated as if they were what they looked like, what the room did when confronted with the only sacrament I still recognize as valid: attention offered without flattery. The map had a wound. The wound contained coordinates and names. The hymn walked them. The devices knew how to listen. The manuals taught men to make absence an adopted saint. The rings stamped winters the world would not admit. I was a custodian. Custodians learn which keys bite. When I finally left the room, when a man learns that leaving is not retreat but reconnaissance, I paused in the corridor to draw a breath that did not ask permission. On the wall between a strum sea and the curatorium, a patch of plaster had been repaired and painted the unconvincing shade bureaucracies prefer to call cream. Into that paint, before it dried, some brave or bored soul had etched 3 small lines with the head of a nail. Not letters, not a picture. 3 lines. I touched them. They were the intervals from the hymn. I did not smile, but the sky in me did something like it. That night, before the bell called men to the comfort that often impersonates God, I wrote a sentence on a scrap I will one day throw into a fire for a fire to refuse. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. I slid it into my breviary beside the Psalms of Lamentation, the only honest songs we publish. Then I returned to the room to bless it with my pajamas of procedures, signatures, locks, reconciled ledgers. The registrar watched from the threshold. He asked nothing. He is a man who knows questions are knives if you hand them to the right mouth. On the way back to my cell, I passed the tourist corridor again, late now, nearly clean of feet. A young guard, bored into the holiness that is almost boredom's twin, was reading a paperback whose cover promised a saint who had once talked to birds. Did the birds talk back? I asked. He shrugged, with the gorgeous indifference of youth. They always do, he said. You just have to pretend you don't hear them. Downstairs, the birds had names like Aries and Virgo and Interim, and their songs could move winters. Up here, they settled into sleep in the rafters. I climbed to my bed and lay down without pretending to. And when sleep finally found me, it did not ask what I had seen. It pressed a ring into my hand and told me to keep watch. I did, until the bell woke me, and then I did again. Some doors open only once. This one had learned to behave like a habit. Tomorrow, I would follow the wound where it widened and the hymn where it called, and pages that had learned to survive would tell me, in the grammar of men who trust ledgers more than souls, what it costs to keep a sky obedient. Tonight, I kept the cost in my mouth like a coin I was not yet ready to spend. I slept with my palm closed around nothing and dreamed of a map that preferred to be whole. The building taught me a habit. Never open a drawer without first asking what story it wants to replace. The Archivum does not merely store. It edits, and then it shelves the edit beside the evidence it replaced the way a careful murderer keeps the first draft of a confession under the pillow. I learned to take the room by strata. One layer could be stomached before the bell, the next after. If you descend too quickly, the air becomes a doctrine you cannot breathe. I began with Sancti Exilientes, the exiled saints. The binding had been repaired with a humility that tried to look like penitence. A careful hand had mended its valleys into plateaus. Inside, the pages maintained the polite tone of bureaucrats discussing a lost child while refusing to admit they were the reason he wandered. Each entry obeyed a rhythm. Name, feast, hagiography summary, conflict duplication, syncretism, overreach, recommendation, attenuation, reassignment, dissolve, implementation, catechetical note, liturgical revision, iconographic guidance. It is hard to hate a rhythm so competent. That is why rhythms are chosen. The first saint I met had once healed wolves as easily as wounds, his feast anchored to a snow day beloved by shepherds for the way it warmed their stories. Conflict, competing local goddess with lupine epithet. Recommendation, reassign miracle to bishop with stronger Rome ties. Subsume feast under presentation. Instruct iconographers to replace wolf with lamb. Implementation notes ran longer. Schools to receive a new lesson. Homilists to be given a model explanation. Printers to withdraw woodcuts that taught children to love a creature that did not ask permission to live. I flipped pages the way a man turns over stones he fully expects to find teeth under. A woman known for childbirth, safety conflict, excess efficacy, superstition risk, rural shrines attracting independent alms. Her miracles were poured into a vessel with better paperwork. A hermit whose visions pinned plague years to climate cycles, conflict, over-correlation with inconvenient weather archives. His feast vanished into regional commemorations, which is the kind of burial that comes with a government letter and flowers nobody will water. At the bottom of the folio, a line that could have been a sigh if ink could exhale. Dilution preferred to deletion. The margin elaborated in the hand I was learning to recognize. A blunt erasure forces the mind to notice. A thinning teaches it to forget. I put my thumb upon that sentence and felt, perhaps for the first time, the honest wish to commit vandalism. Across the aisle, Pontes Obumbrati, the shadowed bridges. I approached with the mind of an auditor and the guts of a man who would prefer not to find what he suspects. The index divided itself by reigns and emergencies. Popes, you know, and versions of them you will never be granted. arranged in a choreography of signatures. A winter where the seal was worn by a stand-in for reasons of health. A spring in which an emissary required immediate imprimatur beyond logistics. A midnight in which two hands shared one ring for the sake of a treaty. Unripe for dawn. The language never admitted a lie. It never had to. Representation, provisionality, custodial signature, the prose of refined fog. Besides several entries, wax rubbings of the ring impressions lay like small moons. One bore a notch the size of penitence. A later note recorded the notch as removed through heat correction. Metal is a better monk than men. It obeys heat with perfect humility. I finished the bridges with the particular nausea reserved for certain medicines and moved to calculi temporis, the reckonings of time. I had already learned the interim tables. Today I found their parent theology, a shelf of pamphlets in multiple hands that argued, with decorous savagery, the morality of adjustment. The first insisted that God smiles upon corrections we make to keep the people from tripping over eclipses. The second retorted that God did not require our smiles as alibis. The third anonymous, terse, proposed the doctrine that would outlive the others. The sky is a pulpit. Choose the homily that keeps peace. Below it, in pencil, someone had added, and invoices. The archivist pencil has a better conscience than the printed page. Further back, a drawer with a cracked nacre handle delivered Charta Nigra, Syllabus Stellarum, the black chart. A syllabus for the stars. Lesson plans on how to narrate comets as teachable fear when tax compliance is low. How to flatten a meteor shower into a gratitude festival when recruitment is needed for a crusade. How to domesticate an eclipse into a parish pageant where the children wear cardboard suns and the parents memorize 3 approved adjectives. The manual was not evil. Evil would have wasted time. It was efficient. At some point in the inventory, I realized I was whispering to myself the prayer of men who open too many drawers. Put it back. Put it back. Put it back. I obeyed mostly. My disobedience was modest and precise. I copied paragraphs. I traced ring impressions. I rehearsed the spider's posture with my fingers until my muscles could find the wound even in the dark. The work turned me into a machine that remembers at speed without leaving visible heat. I kept my appointments with the registrar. He kept his with the doorframe. "You look," he remarked one afternoon, "like a man who has learned that one kind of obedience hides inside another." He did not wait for an answer. "Eat," he added, with a kindness so cold it steamed, and left me a roll that tasted like patience. The day I followed the tear into its music, I did it because words had begun to melt in my mouth. The choir book lay where it had been trained to wait. I opened to the page with the command I could not stop hearing Vacare, and looked again at the notes that refused to fit the choir master's good conduct. Voices remember when they have been asked to behave against their nature. Mine remembered. I let the hum begin, as soft as fear, as steady as a bead keeper's thumb. As the line climbed, the map answered, "I cannot give you a scientific vocabulary for what happened. I can tell you what a custodian notices. The spider's spine locked at 3 marks. The candle narrowed to a needle of itself and then stabilized. The ink along the wound glossed like a tongue run over teeth. There were names along the second register of ticks. I had misread their absence. They had been written in a hand that believed discretion was a sacrament. Thin, nearly transparent, the way an apology is transparent when offered to a crowd. I breathed on them guilty lung. Archivist trick, and the moisture made them incumbent enough to show themselves. Benedictus Minor, Clemens Intervallum, Urbanus Vacans, titles that would look absurd on a martyr's card. Popes that were lesser, interval, vacant, holding pieces on the board, while the hand that played both sides insisted it did not play. The ledger cross-referenced them to treaties, to seasonal corrections, to diplomatic shadows. No biographies, no faces. Ring impressions only, like fingerprints without fingers. The hymn shifted under my breath. Vocare, emptied, thinned into vocare, called. The Latin lives to trick us into hearing one word in another. I followed the call. Names woke like coins in a jar shaken to count. Street, Thecla twice born, filed under dilution for inconvenient agency. Brother Adalric of Rains rerouted to another feast because his weather diaries had developed a habit of being correct. Sister Orsola of the Iron Lung, not a miracle, an invention, redesignated as reliquary to encourage gratitude instead of replication. The spider's legs clicked down, 1, 2, 3, and the cut sang. I had the indecent sensation of discovering that a corridor can be paved with voices. After the music came the ledgers of confession, an alcove off the main hall low ceiling. Any visitor taller than me would have to bow by default, held a series of journals labeled De Oblivione, on forgetting. They were not treatises. They were diaries of confessors trained to accompany those asked to cooperate with memory. Pages bled with apologies, written in the graphologies of men who could not bring themselves to speak the noun coercion. She was asked to relinquish her grandmother's feast and learn to call it by another name. He was told his bell could ring 2 minutes earlier so that the eclipse would be safely over before the crowd looked up. I, too, was instructed to forget what the forgetting cost. Each entry ended with a rubric, a little red ink judgment the journal added to itself. Absolved for obedience, not absolved for silence. I closed the book as one closes a window through which another house is burning. Across from De Oblivion, a cabinet of curricula, the invisible prison I had been promised and did not want to find. Lesson plans for children, how to love calendars, illustrated sheets of colored suns smirking like obeyed monarchs, simple catechisms replacing why with when. When does the feast fall? When it is given. Who gives it? The Church, which loves you. A margin note. If the child asks why twice in a row, tell a story about the saints. Saints will accept questions you cannot allow the sky to answer. I had spent my youth learning to love questions because the Psalms are made of them. Here, questions were fed to saints the way trenches are fed men. This is when the Inquisition arrived, not as men with torches, but as paper templates, formulae praelectionis lecture forms for narrating terror. When a village disobeys the interim, send a messenger who can be both compassionate and credible. He will carry an account of a town that swallowed an eclipse and vomited its children. The story need not be true. It must be stable. Scripts for punishments delivered in tones of pity. Fear freed from labor. Fear made cheap by documentation. Polite terror outruns the lash. I felt my jaw set into the shape of the cord I wore at my waist. I am not proud of that jaw. It does more securing than free speech has patience for. The librarian's pencil returned in the margins as if to keep me alive. Narrative is a leash, it wrote beside a paragraph on compliant festivals. Pull gently, they will learn to love the walk. On another page, above a table aligning eclipses with recruitment drives. We did not invent the sky. We only learned to choose which part of it to read aloud. I wanted to find the pencil's hand and ask him whether he survived the kindness he practiced. I imagine not. Men who write like that tend to be introduced to the custody of their own memories. At this point, the thriller in me insisted upon footsteps. The documentary obeyed and wrote them down. The registrar stood again at the threshold. He is a polite man, made of thresholds. "Do you know," he asked, "why we chain some books?" I looked at the spines wearing iron as if it were sacrament. "To keep men honest," I said. He smiled in that way that makes teeth look like white confessions. "No book has ever needed a chain. The chain is for the reader. It teaches his hands what they are." He left a small thing on the table, a rosary etched with letters that had never sat in a Latin classroom. "Lost and found," he said, which is the archive's way of saying, "This belongs, and you belong with it." Each bead bore a character that looked more carved than written, a runic alphabet used at charta nigra margins, prayer as cipher, counting as steganography. I let it sit against my palm until the beads left their little moons in my skin. A page in the Curatorium Mirabilium cross-referenced similar rosaries to agents tasked with synchronizing festivals in frontier parishes. Suppose you have to carry a schedule across a country that dislikes clocks. Beads will do. When I returned to Calculi Temporis, the air in the room had dropped another degree. I had begun to map the cooling to revelations, like a crude barometer tuned to conscience. A ledger at the bottom of the stack wore a deceptively lively red ribbon. Inside, the phantom time files. They did not call it that. They called it rectifications. Papers arguing for the insertion of ceremonial months that would restore the spiritual fractal, a phrase only a committee could love. Tables showing how many generations it takes for a repaired season to become a native citizen of memory. The answer sat on the page like a patient predator. 3. The third generation will defend the new winter like a grandparent. The first will grumble and forget with help. The second will perform gratitude. The third will enforce. Below, penciled in that courageous hand. Therefore, injure slowly. The grandchildren will do your work. I had been taught to preach hope. I recognized this as its violent cousin, administrated hope. Teach people that tomorrow is a favor you grant. They will thank you, even on days you steal. I took the spider and the map and made a triage of sacrilege, set the legs, traced the cut, allowed the hymn to hum, and watched the second register of names become a list I could carry in my mouth without cutting myself. I would need those names when the room refused to admit it had them. I copied the phrase that had replaced my vows with their underside, custodia memoriae, non notitiae, custody of memory, not of knowledge. I placed it next to the sentence from my own hand, the one I had slid into the breviary. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. The two lines harmonized like bitter cousins, forced to share a table at a funeral. In late afternoon, the tourist bells announced themselves from above their sound, a bouquet you can smell, whether or not you approve of the florist. I let the day enter by sound and not by light. It is how you survive in a place that has weaponized windows. As the peels softened, a page slipped from a ledger I had not touched. Index rerum rescriptorum, the register of rewritten things. I had expected scripture. Scripture was there, orders reshuffled, genealogies compressed, but it was not the only resident. Maps appeared worldly ones, with coasts combed, islands shaved, borders pulled like threads from one cloth into another. Art appeared paintings with saints clarified, as if clarity were a solvent. Frescoes rotated a degree to teach the eye a new center. Science appeared, tables rewritten, explanations sanctioned, hypotheses measured for their capacity to kneel. Each rescript was accompanied by a homiletic, how to preach the change. Emphasize mercy. Praise humility. Call it a return. The verb to return was their favorite lie. Nothing returned. Things were installed and called ancestors. Dusk collected. In the gathering, I felt that modest vibration again, a faint tremor that announced either a building or a man remembering how to be a body. The Manual Vacui whispered beneath its breath. I opened it to a page labeled Case Studies, Educational Relief. Stories of classes in which children were thanked for learning that their grandparents were wrong. That phrase, educational relief, refused to leave my teeth. Relief implies pain removed. Here, the pain removed was curiosity. The relief administered was certainty. I shut the book because I felt a childish impulse to bite it. That night, I allowed myself one unprofessional prayer. I knelt at the highest window I could find, that looked toward a sky the manual had not yet domesticated, and said into the dark, without addressee, "Let the questions live." In response, a star found a break in the city's breath and showed itself as if to offer a receipt. I stood, ashamed of my superstition, and grateful for it. On my way down, I passed the bellkeeper's closet. He is a quiet craftsman, half monk, half machinist, whose hands smell like oil that wanted to be incense. On his table lay a journal not chained, which arrogance taught me to open. "Eclipse protocol received," the entry read, in a handwriting so careful it should have been paid twice. Advance bells by 2 minutes for 8 days prior. Normalize on the 9th. Reason given. Sky correction. Reason felt. Keep eyes low. Remember to remember this. I placed the journal back where it waited to be honest, and touched the bell rope as if to ask forgiveness for the obedient music it was about to make. I will not pretend I did not consider going upstairs for good. Men who leave testimonies like mine often flatter themselves with a story of principled departure. I stayed because the room had not finished speaking, and because the leash had not finished teaching me what my hands were. The next strata would be cooperation Jesuits and Rosicrucians writing each other letters they addressed to enemy and signed colleague, and beyond that revisio, the white leather case that would open as gently as a throat and show me a draft Bible that wore its rearrangements like polite scars. But before those rooms, I had to make myself do the dumbest, bravest thing a keeper can. Copy. I sat, candle burning like a witness who learned to be patient, and wrote the names, the intervals, the instructions, the hymnal coordinates, the sullen wisdom of a pencil that loved the truth but respected the building. When I finished, my hand shook, not from fear, but from the unaccustomed work of letting the mind carry weight instead of the keys. I returned everything exactly as I found it. I locked what I could. I left the rest to their profession. The registrar stood, again, where thresholds drink light. You've lost something, he said, not a question. Yes, I answered. I thought silence was holy. He nodded, with the relief of a teacher who can now proceed. It is, he said, when it protects the right thing. I slept a little that night, the way a man will sleep on a train he has already missed. The map waited. The wound would widen. Names would call and be called. And in the morning, I would open Revisio and learn the price of moving a parable 3 pages to the left so that gratitude arrives before hunger. Tomorrow, for now, the room followed me into the small theater of my skull and sat where the audience pretends to be the dark. The hush there was not sacred. It was enlisted. And still, a question found a chair, crossed its legs, and refused to be polite. I learned to tell the difference between darkness that invites and darkness that warns. The first makes you quiet. The second makes your bones reconsider their contract with your skin. The night I followed the tear to its widest mouth, the building chose the second. Even the key ring made a smaller sound, as if the metal had agreed to whisper in exchange for continued employment. The corridor drafted itself into a wind that could not be blamed on weather. If a place can lean closer, the Archivum leaned. Astrum's sea opened with its usual little theater, the lock clearing its throat before consenting. Inside, the air had lost another degree of its patience. I wrote the fact into the ledger because that is how we survive discoveries. We domesticate them into measurements. The table waited. Cloth, drawer, chart, choir book, spider. It felt increasingly like a liturgy in which the celebrant suspects the sacrament is full of teeth. The map unrolled with the sulky grace of an old soldier asked to stand again. The wound gleamed, a polished absence. I set the spider upon Aries, and let one leg search toward Virgo, the way a man's hand will search for a pulse in a wrist he has no right to hold. The spine clicked, a deeper notch this time, not the modest ascent of previous nights, but the sound of a doorway remembering it had once been a mouth. The hidden latch, under the table, my new confessional, released with less shame than it had shown before. I lifted the oilcloth package that lived in the lower compartment and found the letters had acquired a companion, a thin folio of star positions annotated in 2 hands, one precise and stubborn, the other decorative only where precision refused. Their margin heading, Vacuum Window Trials, a phrase that should not exist except in a physicist's dream and a censor's nightmare. The trials compared real sky to authorized sky on a schedule that felt less like astronomy and more like choreography. For 5 nights running, the notes recorded deviations, 3 degrees here, 5 there, where the official festival cycle demanded a performance the stars did not consent to give. The author had underlined a sentence that wanted to be a verdict. The people will accept discrepancy if the bells arrive early. In a different ink, someone had added, "Teach the bell to shepherd the stars." I thought of the bellkeeper's careful hands. I thought of his journal with its instruction to ring 2 minutes ahead, then to normalize, keep eyes low. The map's wound stopped looking like a surgical line and started looking like a leash. I placed the choir book beside the folio and let the hymn begin, mouth closed, teeth humming as if confiding to themselves. Vacare divided by Vocare, emptied divided by called twined, like 2 threads braided by a patient child. As the line climbed, the second register of names I had coaxed out with breath the night before made themselves legible without fog. They preferred being called the legendary instrument, the brass spider, shivered its soft purr again. Its spine resolved along the hairline marks with the confidence of an old habit. The names pulsed where the tear cut deepest, as if the map were conducting a roll call at a wound. At Leo's absent shoulder, the spider stalled. Not resistance, expectation. I nudged the middle leg half a notch and felt, beneath my palm, the table vibrate in that nearly imaginary way. The wood did not move, but the thought of it moving became indisputable. The drawer within the drawer yielded a third space, narrow as a confession whispered through lattice, a long, shallow trough, wrapped in velvet as if it housed a violin for a giant. Inside lay a brass ark, half a ring, etched with the same impossible alphabet that girded the spider. Along the ark, tiny wells held traces of a dark powder that remembered how to shine, a note in the professorial hand. Horizon gate, dust is star ash, do not inhale. As if anyone in love with questions ever needed to be told. I recognized the ark's intent in the way you recognize a gesture from someone you once loved and had promised not to notice anymore. It was a horizon calibrator, made to be placed at a window or a roofline, aligning its teeth to landmarks so that the authorized sky could be rehearsed against the unruly one without leaving the safety of an institution's throat. The ark had been used recently. The star ash clung to certain wells like old sentences clinging to a judge's breath. I touched one well with the tip of the glove and watched the powder accept the candlelight, unwilling to be glitter, stubborn enough to confess. Who collects star ash? Men who expect the sky to file reports. If the map was music, the ark was an instrument meant to force the hall into tune. I lifted it, the weight was argumentative, and walked it to the door. Across the corridor, the bellkeeper's hatch sat ajar like an invitation that dared to be declined. I took the ark up the steps into the small chamber that rises toward the dome. There, a thin lancet window opened onto the city's shoulder. Beyond, the rim of sky had begun to cool into evening. I set the ark on the sill, its feet gripping like a patient predator, and turned its teeth until they bit the domes and roofs the manual taught as anchor points. The wells of star ash glittered into arguments I could read. The ark wanted me to sing its hymn to the horizon and let the sky be taught. I declined the honor. I sang the hymn I had learned below. The first interval fell where the tear met Aries. The second at a point the ledger labeled Vacans Urbanus. The third, steadier and lower, near the absence of Leo. The city below made its own noise, kitchens, scooters, a couple arguing in a language I did not recognize. But against that human ocean, the ark and the hymn built their small pier. The bells rang, soft and early, a rehearsal disguised as caution. The sky did not move, of course, but in that embarrassing interior sense where a man knows whether he has surrendered or not, I felt the heavens surrender to the timetable, not truly, only in us. The bells herded our attention. The ark organized our permission. The hymn supplied coordinates our throats would later pretend were praise. I put the ark down as gently as betrayal deserves and returned to my room below before anyone could ask what I had calibrated. The registrar met me on the stairs, which is where he liked to be most human. "A walk?" he asked, as if it were something either of us did. I lied politely. He glanced at my hands, at the gloves smudged with dark that might have been dust from any city that insists upon itself. "Do not breathe what the stars shed," he said. "It makes men loyal to the wrong ceilings." He smiled, as if he had told me a joke about cakes. He always smiled that way when he meant harm's opposite. Back at the table, the Manuale Vacui waited with the patience of a book that knows it will be obeyed. I made myself read Case Study 9, Bell Discretion. In a hand coached to appear pastoral, the manual instructed clerics how to precondition a population to accept a shifted season. Advance habit before advancing doctrine, it said. Let the bells gently teach the body what the mouth will later receive as truth. Steps followed. 8 days of 2-minute anticipation, 3 days of normalization, 1 day of public explanation, framed as long-standing custom. A margin pencil, the one that argued so bravely with printed arrogance, added, "Do not lie to yourself about this." I underlined the pencil. I wanted to lift its hand out of time and give it water. A second packet hidden under the ark's velvet included star tables whose dates did not belong to our calendar at all. They belonged to interim days, the unauthorized children of a marriage between arithmetic and ambition. Their headings were stamped with seals that had since been replaced. Neither of the twin rings upstairs, but their elderly parent, a crest before the notch and before the heat. Trial ledger, the slip began, for the vacated winter. It recorded the moving of feast days like furniture in a house whose owner is returning unexpectedly. It set Lenten shadows to fall just so upon the marketplace. It filed a comet under merciful omen because recruitment goals had not been met. A fold-out page mapped where to place storytellers in the square so that their voices crossed at a point where children would stand. Children, a note added with the acid of candor, will calibrate their grandparents with pity. Fear has a smell that institutions never learn to hide. Hot wax, cold metal, and the human salt of men pretending not to sweat. The room smelled that way now. I signed the ledger for the extra candle, though my hand disliked the theater of precaution. The flame steadied because it had learned to be watched. I returned to the choir book. The page with Vacare divided by Vocare had begun to do the thing ink does when it wants to talk back. The letters deepened under light, not because they grew darker, but because my eye admitted it had been refusing them. The Latin, greedy for ambiguity, made me its toy. Empty divided by call, vacate divided by beckon. A verb that can confess and recruit in the same breath is a tool no war would refuse. I tested the names again. Breath, fog, recognition. The second register warmed like fingers before an instrument. Benedictus minor, Clemens intervallum, Urbanus vacans. Not popes in any church that would explain itself to a child, and yet here were their ring rubbings, here their jobs. Sign for a treaty, permit an eclipse, inaugurate a season that would later be explained as God's smile. The ledger linked them to letters in which they never appeared, as men only as verbs. Sign, seal, permit, inaugurate. I copied 3 rubbings onto paper with the side of a pencil, the way a boy copies a coin with wax. The impressions looked like bruised moons. I folded them into the breviary, where I kept lamentation. If the Psalms were honest, they would have carried ring rubbings too. From the Curatorium Mirabilium, I stole a minute to visit the reliquary labeled Spiritus the Engineer's vacuum pump, turned into a shrine. Its valves still spoke the patient language of lungs. Someone had fitted it with a tiny slot for coins, the way you tame an animal by feeding it in public. I pressed my ear to its guilt and listened to air be taught to mean miracle. The pump accepted the role as an obedient actor. The stage does not argue about its play. The Inquisition templates returned to my table because the map's wound had walked me to them. They were scripts for narrating compliance, but also for narrating resistance, so that the resistant would feel themselves included in a rhythm designed to digest them. When a village insists on the old feast, the templates refuse to call anything by its name, send a gentle confessor to collect stories about their grandparents. Publish the best stories with illustrations of grateful children. Add a paragraph where the confessor admits he too loved the old way. The people will see their love honored and their obedience affirmed. At the margin, terror is extravagant. Respect is cheaper. The pencil did not forgive. The night had the texture of a long hallway that refuses to end. I do not know how many minutes I devoted to the small prayer of trying not to hate the men whose hands had been steady when they wrote such sentences. Hatred makes your breath shallow. Shallow breath betrays you to rooms that enjoy lungs. I made myself a clerk again, copying, indexing, testing the spider at every register. Between Aries and Virgo, near the lion's deliberate absence, the hymn stumbled. Not a mistake, a rest, a bar of silence written into music for the sake of a gesture in the dark. The spider's spine refused to advance until my hum learned the rest's shape. When I gave the silence its measure, the hidden trough yielded something I had not suspected it could possess, a little packet of thread. Dark, lustrous, the thread could almost have been hair if hair could keep a note. Wrapped around a horn of wood, the thread hummed all by itself when I lifted it, the way some strings remember the note they were tuned to when they lived on bigger instruments. Linea Vocare read a slip, calling line. The instruction beneath it was a riddle. Stretch along the wound, sing until it stays. I did not want another tool. Tools turn men into the reasons they exist. But I took the line and stretched it across the tier and sang the interval as one hums into the throat of a beast he hopes will be intrigued rather than offended. The thread warmed between my fingers, a heat not of flame but of consent. It stayed, not glued, not tied, simply willing. The chart looked sutured, as if I had betrayed the wound into thinking it had earned a bandage. The notes on the ark's wells glowed very slightly, a trick of light eager to be called coincidence. I called it nothing. I watched. What do you call it when a map shows you not where you are, but where your obedience thinks you should be? The torn sky, with its thread humming along the rest near Leo, began to look less like a document and more like a stage diagram. It marked entrances and exits. It marked where the bells should confuse your expectation and where the comet should be told to behave. The interim tables, those little mechanical cheats, fit into the staff of the hymn like rests you are taught to love. The manual of emptiness had not exaggerated. Absence can be taught until it feels like mercy. I broke posture. I let the thin kind of anger that keeps a man from drowning in a bucket sit in my ribcage. I said out loud quietly, because the room was a jealous god. No. Then I did what no instrument in that room was designed to endure. I sang the wrong note. Not an error defiance. A half step above the interval the hymn had trained into my throat. The thread quivered, not in protest but in recognition, the way a dog will cock its head when you pronounce its name in a language you are not supposed to know. The spider's spine clicked backward by one hairline mark and revealed a third register, not feasts, not names, but places. They were not places on earth. They were windows, tower slit, cloister turn, roofline corner, labeled only by stone's private names. Each place corresponded to a time when the bell could do what the ark demanded. The third register taught how to stand in a city and feel the authorized sky. The map was a manual for choreography. The stars, the bells, the mouths, the windows, the children holding their father's hands. The bell rang again early, obedient, a small tug upon the leash the city had consented to wear. I placed my palm flat on the table and felt the slightest reply pulse up through wood into wrist. The building, too, had been taught the hymn. The Archivum was not only a custody of memory, it was a conductor. I returned the line to its horn, unhooked the spider, closed the folios. I breathed through my nose like a man taught not to cough in a chapel. The registrar appeared in the doorframe and did not enter. "Do you like the view from the bell window?" he asked, as if I had ever been capable of liking views for their own sake. "It teaches the sky to keep pace," I said. He nodded, as if we had spoken about bread. "Pace," he repeated. "The virtue of institutions, the vice of time. Who taught you to say that?" "The same men who taught you to keep ledgers," he said. "They pay us in sentences." He tilted his head. "Has the map begun to obey you yet?" "I sang the wrong note," I said, "because sometimes telling the truth is the only way to be sure you still have a mouth." His smile was smaller. "Then it has begun," he said, and was gone before I could ask where such beginnings prefer to end. I carried the ark back to its velvet and sealed the lower compartment as if that could keep the roof from memorizing what I had done. The manual slid shut with the relief of a scolded child. The choir book closed like a kind hand. I wrote the night's temperatures, the bell's minutes, the spider's teeth into the ledger, and did not sign my name the way ordinary men sign theirs. I signed as men do who know their names have been practicing erasure, with initials that refuse to apologize. On my way up, I stopped at the bellkeeper's room. He sat hunched over the journal, copy-penciling the day's obedience. I put the ark upon his table softly, as if it were sleeping and I did not wish to wake it. He glanced at it, then at me, and his eyes did not accuse. They registered. He lifted a finger toward the ceiling, as if to say, "We both have keys. They will pretend not to count." 2 minutes? He asked. 8 days, I said, which is the limit the manual loved. He nodded and wrote 8 small marks in the margin of a page where the rope's fibers had left a calendar of their own. "I keep a second ledger," he admitted, not proud, not ashamed. "The ledger of what I felt when I did what I was told." He closed the book without showing me. He is a better monk than I will ever be. In my cell, the ceiling did not accept lamplight like a composed surface. It received it like a confession. Flickers, retreats, the kind of shiver walls dismiss as furnace work. I lay down under my one clean blanket and counted myself into a list of names that no catechism had invented room for. Minor, intervallum, vacans, twice born, of reigns, of the iron lung. I added my own, just the initials. The register in my skull clicked along a hairline rack and yielded a drawer I had not expected to receive. Not a secret, not a tool. Simply a decision. What happens when the torn sky opens is not that you learn a new constellation. It is that you learn the price of the old one. You learn why the lion cannot afford to have a shoulder. You learn how a rest in a hymn can teach a city to accept a missing winter. You learn that bells are not servants of time. They are wardens. You learn to stop asking who did this and start asking what you must do with what you now own. Morning would require revisio, the white leather. The drafted Bible with parables moved 3 pages, so gratitude precedes hunger. The ring bruise in wax, and then scraped away. The word return used as a lie again. But tonight belonged to a wound that had accepted a thread and sung back when I lied on purpose. The map knew the shape of my disobedience now. The Archivum did too. I turned my face to the wall and let the wall be what it had always been in this city, an accomplice that confesses nothing and sees everything. I fell asleep, holding nothing, and woke with the taste of star ash in my mouth, though I had not inhaled. Some ceilings are loyal beyond reason, some skies too. The morning I chose revisio, Rome wore its cleanest light. I have always distrusted beautiful mornings. They cover their teeth with linen. I signed the lamp ledger, collected the 2 candles the registrar now set out without asking, and took the stairs like a penitent who knows his prayer has become evidence. The door to the white leather case was not locked. That is one of the Archivum's earliest lessons. Locks are for visitors. Family is restrained by habit. The revisio case lay on a shelf that made a virtue of being ordinary. No gilded edge, no warning plate, just the soft arrogance of white leather that has survived handling. I opened it with both hands, the way you lift a child after a fever has broken. Inside, a draft Bible rested on muslin, not apocrypha, not heresy. A working copy, margins wide as fields, passages cut into slips and pinned like butterflies, chapters rearranged with a care that expected applause. The first page was an index of movement arrows like veins, notes like sutures. The parable of the workers advanced 3 leaves to teach gratitude before hunger. The healing of the withered hand paired with a different Sabbath reading 4 optics. The genealogies compressed to a merciful length so that pews would not empty like lungs. A note in the professorial hand drew a square around a single word, return. The margin pencil had written, in a script that refused to let me relax, nothing returns. Things are installed and taught to call themselves ancestors. I turned a page and found wax. The imprint of a ring had been pressed into the lower margin and then scraped away. The leather kept the memory of pressure, the way skin remembers a wedding band removed after a long marriage. A pale circle, a bruise of authority where authority had refused to sign its name. I held the page to the candle and saw the circular depression take on a shadow like a moon learning to be honest. Stamped beside it in a dry, brittle ink, per mandatum, by mandate. Mandates like to live without fingerprints. Pinned to the next leaf, an instruction sheet for homiletic synchronization, how to preach the new order so that the body does not notice the rearrangement the mind performs. Lead with comfort. Conclude with necessity. Call it a return. The pencil scratched a small skull above the word, and cite a father before he can object. There were cue lines for the celebrant. Pause on the 3rd clause. Smile at mercy. Lower the voice at tradition. The theater was so confident, it had stopped apologizing for being theater. At the back of the case, tucked like a whisper, a packet labeled deletions. I wanted to slam the lid. I didn't. Inside, names of figures whose stories had been absorbed, thinned, reassigned like the exiled saints. But this list confined itself to narrative casualties. The woman whose parable made men uncomfortable when the harvest failed was replaced by a man whose gratitude could be modeled by boys. The line about the rich passing through a needle was annotated with a clarification, proposing that the gate called Needle narrowed at night, and that this explained the metaphor for those who had investments in metaphor's safety. Beneath the clarification, the pencil wrote with cheerful malice, "Explain away a blade, and you will learn to love night." I tied the packet and slid it back. I am not brave, but I know when a room wants to eat, and when a man has already become a corpse. Across the aisle, the Societate's custodes waiting case a cabinet, whose drawers have the sober good manners of a banker, held correspondences between Jesuits and Rosicrucians. I imagined rivalry. The files preferred logistics. Friendly custody of volumes R17-R19 transferred for the winter to Collegio Romano, wrote one hand that loved neatness more than victory. In exchange, filters for the telescope delivered to the brothers, as they are presently more capable of repair. A note sealed with wax advised that one should cross town by the three-walled streets, because the two-walled exposed one's shadow to the wrong windows. Keep your shadow, the registrar would later tell me, like you keep your breath in the building. Here, too, the pencil told the secret that wanted to live under the coat. Rivalry makes a cheap theater. Cooperation keeps the stage standing. Attached to the letters, a small pamphlet bearing both orders' seals. No names, only verbs. Coordinate, harmonize, recover. In the margin, a purely human hand had written, "Pretend we are enemies. We will work faster." I closed the drawer and let the air rest. Men who read too quickly in rooms like these are asking for the architect to introduce them to the floor by the shortest route. I returned to De Oblivione, the confessor ledgers, not to punish myself, but to remember that the building still allowed the first person to exist. A diary entry from a priest assigned to a frontier parish described a dog that learned the new bells faster than its owner did. "The dog comes 2 minutes early to sit by the door," the man wrote. "The owner follows with an apology he cannot name. The rubric at the bottom, absolved for obedience. Not absolved for silence, glowed like a coal that refuses to die under ash. I realized I had been holding my breath. My lungs returned to their practice, slow as monks. I lifted the rosary of runes, the bead cipher I had been pretending not to understand, and found within its loop a fold, a thin paper label, rubbed almost blank by years of fingers, that read, "Calendarium per digitos." A calendar by fingers. 10 beads on one side, 10 the other, 5 in the tail, a 25-day measure that allowed a man to carry a hidden interim without anyone watching his clock. You can walk across a country by saying the rosary. You can also move a month with it if you have been taught how to rename days under your breath. I laid the rosary back down, with a respect I do not give to weapons, and opened the Charta Nigra, the black chart, again. My earlier inventory had not reached the appendix. The sky as pastoral, formats for schoolrooms, a chalk sketch that would teach 10-year-olds to draw the ecliptic as their grandparents always did, complete with a note instructing the teacher to praise memory while installing the new. The pencil's commentary was tender and merciless. Adults break loudly. Children bend quietly. In the hallway beyond the door, a cleaning woman sang the kind of song that keeps bones from resigning. I envied her education. The bell sounded early, of course, and the room's temperature dropped, as if the archivum were a lung that prefers cold air. The manual vacui fell open where I had left the ribbon. Educational relief, parental briefings, scripts for telling parents that a correction was being made for their children's sake. Begin with health metaphors, the manual advised. The calendar had a fever. We have cooled it, the pencil replied without ceremony. It was the child you cooled. I moved to the Archivum Sigillorum for relief, and found none. The twin rings, one before the notch, one after the heat, sat as if on a small beach of velvet, counting the wax tides. I pressed them again, guilty of love for clear impressions. I tried not to think of treaties that lived only long enough to be signed by a person without a name. Under the tray of rings, a drawer I had missed held ribbons, the cord sometimes attached to papal bulls, dyed, twisted, embedded with hair. Each ribbon bore a tag listing what document it had served and under which sealing it had been cut. Sealings again. The building preferred the language of what hangs above, a label I did not expect. Syllabus vacui attached to Lenten clarifications and general emptiness catecheses. Someone had institutionalized emptiness as a syllabus, and the rings had dressed it. I felt the clean type of anger that does not need heat. It sits in the lungs and demands capacity. My hands found the table and stayed there until they remembered to live. I returned to the revisio case because I wanted to know the price of moving a parable 3 pages. The price was counted in letters. The final packet housed responses from parish priests asked to pilot the revised order. "My people were grateful," wrote one. "They thought themselves remembered." "We avoided confusion," said another, "by avoiding the word change." A third wrote, "What I had been waiting for one man to write with blood. I cannot teach a lie and keep my mouth. I will not keep both." The packet included no sequel. The pencil had drawn a small cross where a signature might have lived. Footsteps. Not the registrar's. He is a violin. This was a boot learning how to be velvet. The door frame, filled with a stranger who looked like a clean page. His collar had the bright arrogance of new thread. "Father," he said, and his mouth was generous with the title the way men are generous with coins they plan to reclaim. "May I see your authorization for the revisio case?" I showed him the ledger. He did not look at it. He looked at me, which is the form authorization prefers when it stops pretending to be paper. "And your reason?" he asked, as if reasons were permissions you could check out with keys. I said, "Custody, because that word buys time in this city." He examined my mouth the way a doctor examines a wound that insists it is a mouth. "I will return tomorrow," he said, and left a slice of air behind him where a man should have been. The registrar arrived late, apologizing to the dust with every step. He has the gift of saying nothing in a way that feels like mercy. "Visitors," he acknowledged, glancing down the corridor the boot had taken. "Sometimes they come to weigh a room. They like to see if the door has learned to lock itself." He touched the revisio lid and closed it as gently as reproach. "A little less for today," he said, which is how archivists prescribe survival. I took his advice and toured the margins, the bellkeeper, the choir loft. The little windows the map had listed as places rather than earth. The bellkeeper's journal lay open to a page titled 8. He had drawn 8 tiny circles, each with a short line angled like a sundial's stubborn hour. "I rang 2 minutes ahead," he had written, and children corrected their parents. The parents thanked the church for having such well-taught children. He had added a private line I should not have stolen with my eyes. "I do not know where God lives in this." The choir loft offered sheet music marked with faint pencil rests in places that would make a congregation inhale at the same moment. Rests are more obedient than notes. They require the whole body to agree. The choirmaster had penciled a smiley face beside one bar, as if to apologize for cleverness. I traced the rest with my finger, the way one touches a scar on someone else's face and pretends it is charity. In the cloister that turned twice before losing its nerve, I found one of the windows the map had listed. The stone around it wore the rubbed patchwork texture of hands that had leaned their foreheads against it for decades. Below the sill, on a seam in the ashlar, 3 shallow gouges the intervals from the hymn. It is a special kind of loneliness to recognize your own private note carved by someone who died before you were born. Back at my desk, I wrote what the day had taught me in words small enough to fit beneath my tongue if anyone asked me to open my mouth. The Inquisition was not a whip, it was a script. It taught men to speak terror softly enough that people thanked them for clarity. Orders that were supposed to be enemies loaned each other tools like neighbors who sweep the same stretch of street. Silence was not honor, it was payroll. The price of moving a parable was a calendar that learned to lie without ever forming the letter L. I folded the paper and slipped it behind the Lamentations again. The breviary had become a museum of crimes committed with hymns. Before Compline, I searched the De Oblivione ledgers for a line I remembered seeing in my peripheral vision, and found it on the last page of a volume that had learned to go stale. It is not sin to remember. It is sin to make remembering illegal. I wrote the sentence on the inside of my wrist with a librarian's pencil and let the dust stick to it like a seal. Night gathered its agreements. The bells rehearsed their obedience, and the city moved 2 minutes closer to a truth it would later call tradition. I set the instruments in order: the spider, the line, the arc, the rings, like a captain laying out maps he does not plan to survive. The registrar watched from the threshold and said, almost kindly, "If you mean to leave, say nothing. If you mean to speak, leave faster." I did not sleep. I rehearsed a mouth. I thought of names my church had taught me to love and of the mouths that had loved them into obedience. I thought of the bell as a man who rings not to tell the hour but to enforce it. I thought of my own keys, their teeth polished by me, their bite accidentally trained to draw my own blood first. I remembered the manual of emptiness, and wondered whether there is a manual of return anywhere in the world that is not a lie. There isn't. Return is a story we tell when we're ashamed of the new. Toward dawn, if dawn can be said to visit rooms that serve the night, I wrote a last line for the day in a hand that was too tired to pretend calligraphy. I kept custody of memory. I was paid to leash it. I am breaking payroll. Then I lay my head on the desk like a penitent who has paid his tithe in questions and waited to see if a ceiling would admit me as a citizen. Tomorrow would be climax. The white leather would open like a throat and tell the rest. The ring would leave a bruise somewhere that could be seen. The call to action would have to be spoken aloud, because if you whisper in rooms like these, the walls will adopt your words and raise them as their own. For now, I closed the last lamp with 2 fingers, felt the wick die like a well-trained animal, and walked past the door frames that had learned my weight. The corridor wind found me and escorted me up like a courteous warden. Above, Rome exhaled in its sleep. Below, the Archivum inhaled. In between, I practiced breathing that belonged to neither, and tried to keep a question alive long enough to see if it could grow into a voice. I came before dawn because I wanted the building to find me honest. Night had finished ironing its darkness. Morning had not yet remembered its chores. The stairs held their breath, the way a witness holds a secret he intends to tell. I signed the lamp ledger with hands that knew they were writing an exit and a beginning at once. 2 candles, 1 man, a corridor that had learned the rhythm of my bones. The white leather case waited on its shelf, like a gentleman who does not stand when you enter because he owns the room already. Revisio. I lifted the lid as if the air itself were breakable. Inside, the working Bible, margins fat with negotiations, slips pinned like butterflies that had been told their wings were minutes, a theology of choreography dressed as pastoral care. I placed the candles on either side the way a surgeon places lights on either side of a body he does not intend to lose. I did not pray. I have learned to distrust prayers that arrive on schedule. The index of movement greeted me with its arrows and apologies. I read none of them. I found instead the packet I had not yet dared to open, resignations, not letters from men, permissions, signed in that waxless, ring-bruised way, granting stories leave to stop existing. A parable, it said, is hereby invited to retire from public service and return as an anecdote in homilies during harvest season. A miracle is permitted to dissolve into weather. A genealogy will accept promotion to poetry, which is how you kill a genealogy without confessing murder. At the bottom of the packet, a single page, thin as skin, labeled simply, People. The page listed no names, only verbs, obeyed, adjusted, forgot, defended. I closed the packet and opened the book to the place the professor's hand had drawn a square around return. A tiny cross-stitch of letters in pencil had added itself overnight. Return is a costume. Ask who tailored it. The building teaches handwriting when it wants witnesses. I traced the square, then turned the page, and met the bruise of authority again, the circular depression, where a ring had pressed and been scraped away. I pressed the pad of my index finger into the hollow, and felt how paper remembers the weight of what pretended not to touch it. Per mandatum. Mandate without signature, ownership without face. The hidden letters I had found in Chapter 4, vacuum window trials, manual vacui, were cross-referenced here in a clerk's cheerful cursive. See, also, rectifications, syllabus vacui, charta nigra appendices. The catalogue itself was beginning to behave like a living animal, directing my hand, aligning my breath, matching my pulse. That is the climax nobody writes down, when a room decides you are an organ worth investing in. I opened Index Rerum, Rescriptarum, the register of rewritten things, and found the entry I feared. Beatitudes, placement. A neat argument for teaching congratulations first, so that hunger arrives wearing gratitude's coat. Down the margin, the pencil had been busy. Feed a starving man, and he will bless you. Feed him after you rename his hunger, and he will bless your calendar. I read the sentence aloud once, and let it sit in the room like a stone on a priest's tongue. Across the corridor, the Archivum Sigillorum held its little moons. I pressed the twin rings again into warm wax, watched their siblings argue over who had first refusal on the truth. The ribbons beneath their tray, the cords that dressed decrees, now included one I had missed, a slender thread of hair braided into the die. Human hair. The tag read, Lenten Clarifications, Parish Kit. Someone had thought to add the bodies of believers to the cords that tied their explanations. There is an elegance to such cruelty that should frighten us more than uglier things do. Back in Estrum C, the table recognized my hands before my hands recognized themselves. The chart unrolled with the pride of an old soldier, told he is needed just once more. The tear shone. The spider's legs found their stations, the way a man who has betrayed a friend knows the route to his door by the sound his shoes make on the last steps. I set the ark aside. Today would not be a day for teaching the sky to rehearse. Today I would listen to a different ceiling. The drawer within the drawer gave up its third secret without the courtesy of a click. Beneath the velvet where the ark slept, a letter had lodged itself like a guilty tooth. Latin, but written in a mouth that had learned kindness before command. Ad fratrem custodem, to the brother custodian. You will be tempted, it said, to believe that we secure these instruments to keep untrained hands from spoiling truth. The opposite is closer. We keep them to spoil truth without untrained hands noticing. Be careful which part of your soul says Amen. I sat down because men do not stand well when truth approaches them quickly. I placed the linea Vocare, the calling line, across the wound and hummed the interval as if calling a child from a dark stair. The thread warmed and stayed. The second register of names answered like coins shaken awake. Benedictus minor, Clemens intervallum, Urbanus vacans. The third register of places, window, rooftop, cloister turn glowed in my understanding without turning visible ink into vanity. I gave the rest near Leo its full measured silence, not as surrender this time but as recognition. Sometimes obedience is diagnostic. It tells you which ligament the knee has lost. The spider settled into its hairline groove and then did something I had not seen. It shifted one tooth of its own accord, as if acknowledging a note I had not yet sung. The choir book answered the gesture by showing me a second refrain, faint, between the staves, like a ghost between two mirrors. Not Vacare divided by Vocare. Another verb, close enough to kiss. Memorare, remember. It had been there all along, written in a diminishing ink, designed to surface only when a mouth had learned the other two faithfully enough to be trusted with the third. Empty, call, remember. I sang it, not aloud. A man knows when his lungs would be impolite. I sang it in the place men keep under the tongue for medicine they mean to hold back from the stomach. The thread trembled, not as a string does, but as a hunting dog does upon the first honest scent. The map responded. The hairline marks revealed a fourth register so narrow I doubted my eyes. Not feast, not name, not place. Witness, little notches beside dates and windows and shadows, instructing a future custodian where to stand in order to be seen by someone who was tired of pretending the building existed to keep books. The map taught me how to be caught. I understood the purpose only when the footsteps arrived, the polished boot that had come yesterday to ask for my reason. He did not begin with the doorframe's false courtesy. He crossed the threshold as one crosses a floor he has paid for. His face was the kind handsome men make when they are paid extra to conceal it. "Father," he said, "your access to Revisio is now concluded. Please prepare a summary of your work and surrender your keys." Keys. I looked down at the ring that had grown my posture into its shape. Teeth for turning, teeth for biting. I felt the ledger inside me search for an adjective. It chose finished. "I'm keeping custody," I said, because the building had taught me which word could still buy a few seconds of truth. He frowned at the map as at a pet that had disobeyed its training. "Custody is granted, not claimed. It's returned," I said, which is the accurate direction for a custody. The institution forgot it borrowed from a soul. He reached his hand out not for the map, but for the choir book. I moved it to the side, as a man moves a child out of the path of a cart. He watched the movement and memorized me as a problem. "We will normalize your work," he said. "You will say your farewell mass, receive gratitude and rest." The verbs knew their assignments: normalize, receive, rest. Rest is what obedience is called when it has been made to kneel. I stood into the witness notch the fourth register had indicated. I did not know what would happen. The man with the boot was framed against the door. Behind him, the corridor held a slice of Rome that would wake soon and call it morning without asking for proof. "You will write," he said. "You will praise. You will return what you borrowed." He nodded toward the ark, and the spider and the line I had stretched like a stitch across a wound. I heard myself say what I did not know I had the mouth for. No, not the angry no of a boy. The clerical no that tastes of old promises and understands payroll. The Manuale Vacui insists upon no at least once, though it never prints it. He cocked his head in the polite violence of bureaucrats. No, I said nothing else to him. I spoke to the bell. It takes many men and many tools and many seasons to teach a city to listen to metal. It takes a smaller, quieter thing to teach metal to listen to a mouth. I hummed the Memorare refrain in the lowest part of my throat, the part that would offend no room and stir no air, and I watched as the bell-keeper above us, invisible, hesitated. 2 minutes early, every morning for 8 days, the bell had learned to govern. Today, it paused, as if hearing another ledger being written in a room it had never visited. Then it rang on time. It is a small thing. Punctuality. In a city like ours, it is a revolution. The boot turned, frowned. Paper does not know how to frown. Men do. "What have you done?" he asked. "I let something remember itself," I said, and the spider's spine relaxed as if the map, too, had found punctuality restful. The fourth register's notch shimmered not physically, in the mind where truth keeps its receipts. "You can have my keys," I said. "You cannot have my custody." He moved to take the ring, not roughly, but with the assumption of mandate. I placed it on the table with the gentleness a man uses to set a cup beside the bed of someone who will not wake. It is not drama to say this. The keys bit me as I let them go. A last allegiance or a farewell. "We will reassign you," he said, as if the verb were a sacrament. "We will save you from yourself." I laughed. Quietly, because the Archivum punishes impolite noise with dust that will not wash off. "You taught me. I don't need saving," I said. "You taught me how to count." I gestured toward the revisio case. How to see when a parable has been moved 3 pages so that gratitude wears hunger like a coat. How to see when a winter has been filed under mercy. How to hear when a bell rings 2 minutes early and calls itself tradition. I stepped out of the witness notch and let the man with the boot see an empty space that would remember him now, whether or not he wrote his name down. He left without closing the door. The door closed itself. I replaced the choir book and the map and the ark and the line with the tenderness a man learns when he knows he is tending the last evening of a thing he loves. I signed the ledger, not with initials, but with the sentence the pencil had given me, and I had added to, "Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. Memory wasn't fragile. It was arrested." I left the sentence there as if it were a relic only my hand recognized. The registrar came like weather that refuses to apologize. He saw the keys on the table and did not touch them. "You made a choice," he said, and the sentence did not sound like judgment, because he is a man who has outlived his appetite for that sport. "You will need a door that opens onto a road." I have one, I said, which was both true and bravado. He nodded toward the breviary, where my lamentations kept their ring-rubbings, and my wrist kept its pencil sentences, and my mouth kept its memorare. Take only what you can carry without permission, he said. If you must hide, hide in a question. Above, Rome remembered morning. Below, the Archivum remembered me. Between those two loyalties, a man is cut to the measure of his competence. I walked the corridor one last time, and touched the 3 small gouges on the stone, those intervals someone carved before I was born. I put my forehead to the window, the way a poor pilgrim blesses a reliquary he has not paid to see. Then I left. Outside, the city was exactly itself, which is the kind of miracle I still believe in. Laundry had opinions. Pigeons negotiated treaties with shoes. A boy practiced a whistle that would one day annoy a woman into loving him. The bell rang on time. Nobody fell to their knees. No star apologized. Nothing broke, except the habit of being 2 minutes grateful. I walked with my hands empty and my custody heavy. I have no weapons. Custodians rarely do. We carry ledgers and the stubbornness to enter what we see. I would like to tell you that I left Rome by a gate saints had forgotten, but gates are theatrical. I took a street that performs anonymity very competently. A bus hissed. A nun laughed. A tourist took a photograph of a window that does not appear beautiful in photographs. The world continued. And now I am speaking to you where your light is low, and your ceiling knows more about you than your friends do. This is the part that matters. Not the rings, not the maps, not the clever instruments and their obedient arcs, not even the bell that chose punctuality over policy when it heard a little song in the floor. What matters is that you are a custodian, even if nobody gave you keys. If you have stayed with me through the corridors and the drawers and the little crimes that refer to themselves as corrections, do this when this story ends. Don't stop asking questions. Ask your calendar where it was born. Ask your favorite parable who moved it 3 pages and why your hunger had to learn to smile first. Ask the bell in your city whether it rings for mercy or for habit. Pick one little truth you have been taught to accept and ask it for its passport. If it refuses to show you a stamp, quarantine it from your obedience until it learns manners. When you pass a church hours or anybody's look at its windows and ask whether they are teaching light or policing it, when a man with a bright collar or a bright badge says return, ask him to name the tailor. When a mouth tells you to be grateful, listen for the paper rustling under the word. Gratitude is honest. It does not need to be scheduled. If you are a parent, teach a child that questions are not illnesses. Teach them to love rests in music without learning to love missing winters. Show them how to smell the difference between a miracle and a machine inside a reliquary. Let them ring on time. Let them ring late sometimes, too, so they know what freedom sounds like. The most dangerous thing to them is memory returning. Not an assassin, not a headline. Memory. Personal, stubborn, impolite memory that refuses to be thinned. Remember the smell of rain in stone. Remember the weight keys teach a spine. Remember a map that learned your voice. Remember a bell that chose honesty over choreography. Remember that silence is a tool, and tools can be taken away from the wrong hands. I will go by a road that does not admit saints, because it does not recognize us when we take off our work. I will carry the names of those interim popes who were verbs and the memory of those exiled saints whose miracles healed wolves and weather. I will keep the Memorare where my mouth can reach it without asking. If you want a prayer, take the only one I have left that won't bruise your mouth. May your questions outlive their answers. May you be punctual only when truth is. May you learn to love light, not because it is scheduled, but because it is good. And if one night soon you descend stairs where the air cools politely and a ledger waits for a name, sign it with a question. Then turn the key once and listen. If the door opens, do not applaud. Doors are not actors. Walk through. Do not stop asking. Let memory return. I promise you, the sky can handle it.